You've probably felt it before. That subtle pull to check if someone liked what you said, the quick glance to see if your message was read, the quiet hope that your effort will be noticed. Most people live inside that gravity their entire lives. But then there are others. People who move through the world as if no invisible jury is watching. They don't perform. They don't explain themselves unnecessarily. They don't chase approval. And strangely, the more they refuse to ask for validation, the more the world seems to offer it to them anyway. The psychology of people who don't need validation is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It's almost unsettling in how calm it feels. And once you understand it, you can never unsee it in yourself or in others. These people aren't cold. They aren't arrogant. And they're not immune to emotion. What separates them is something deeper and far less obvious. They have learned, consciously or not, that their sense of self does not require external confirmation to exist. They don't wake up every day asking, "Am I enough?" Because at some point they stopped outsourcing the answer. And that single internal shift changes everything. How they speak, how they choose, how they love, how they walk away, and how they stay. If you've ever wondered why certain people seem unshakable in rooms where everyone else is quietly competing, this is where the answer begins. And if you stay with this until the end, you'll notice something subtle happening inside you too. You'll start recognizing moments where you've been trading pieces of yourself for approval without even realizing it. And once that awareness clicks, there's no going back. If this kind of understanding feels like something you want more of, staying close to conversations like this becomes almost instinctive. At the core of not needing validation is a different relationship with identity. Most people build their identity like a mirror maze, reflecting feedback from parents, teachers, friends, partners, bosses, and strangers. Every compliment adds a brick. Every criticism removes one. Over time, the structure becomes unstable because it depends on constant reinforcement. People who don't need validation stepped out of that maze. They built their identity from internal alignment instead of external applause. Their question is not, "Do they like this?" but "Is this true to me?" That question becomes a compass, and a compass doesn't care who's watching. This doesn't happen overnight. Often it's born from disappointment, from realizing that approval is conditional, inconsistent, and sometimes manipulative. Many people reach a breaking point where they notice that no amount of praise actually satisfies them. The high fades quickly, the hunger returns. And in that realization, a quiet rebellion begins. They stop performing, they start observing. They notice how validation changes people, how it makes them louder, smaller, nicer, meaner, more agreeable, less honest. And something inside them refuses to live that way. One of the most misunderstood traits of people who don't need validation is their silence. Silence is often mistaken for insecurity or indifference, but psychologically it's neither. Silence for them is a sign of internal fullness. They don't rush to fill space because they don't feel empty. They don't feel the urge to prove intelligence, value, or relevance in every conversation. When they speak, it's intentional. And when they don't, they're not anxious about how that silence is perceived. That alone gives them an unusual presence. People lean in, not because they demand attention, but because they don't chase it. Another defining trait is how they handle disagreement. When someone challenges them, they don't immediately defend or collapse. They listen, they evaluate. If the criticism aligns with truth, they integrate it without shame. If it doesn't, they discard it without resentment. There's no dramatic emotional spike because their self-worth isn't on trial. Most people experience disagreement as a threat to identity. For someone who doesn't need validation, disagreement is simply data. This emotional neutrality is rare, and it often confuses people who are used to emotional reactions as a form of engagement. This is where the psychology becomes especially interesting. When you don't need validation, your nervous system operates differently in social situations. There's less baseline anxiety, less hypervigilance, less scanning for approval signals. This frees up mental energy, making you more present, more perceptive, and more grounded. Others can feel this even if they can't explain it. Humans are remarkably sensitive to internal states. We pick up on calm confidence the same way animals sense safety. That's why people who don't seek validation often become quiet leaders without trying. They also have a very specific relationship with praise. Praise doesn't inflate them. It doesn't define them. They appreciate it, but they don't cling to it. There's no internal voice whispering, "Keep this up," so they keep liking you. Because of that, their behavior stays consistent whether they're admired or ignored. This consistency builds trust. People sense that what you see is what you get. And in a world full of emotional shapeshifting, that's magnetic. What's rarely talked about is the loneliness that can come with this mindset, especially early on. When you stop seeking validation, you stop playing certain social games. You stop laughing at things you don't find funny. You stop agreeing just to belong. You stop over-explaining your choices. And when you do that, some people fall away. Not because you've changed in a negative way, but because the unspoken contract of mutual validation has been broken. For many, that's the hardest part. It's tempting to go back, to soften yourself, to re-enter the performance. But people who truly don't need validation accept that belonging to themselves sometimes means being misunderstood by others. They also choose relationships differently. Instead of asking, "Do they want me?" they ask, "Do I respect who I am around them?" This subtle shift filters out dynamics based on dependency, approval seeking, or emotional bargaining. They don't stay where they have to shrink, and they don't chase people who make affection conditional. This doesn't make them emotionally unavailable, it makes them emotionally selective. And that selectivity is often mistaken for arrogance by those who rely on validation to feel secure. One of the most powerful psychological advantages they have is resilience. When your self-worth isn't tethered to others' reactions, failure doesn't become a personal indictment. Rejection doesn't define you. Criticism doesn't collapse you. This doesn't mean they don't feel pain. It means pain doesn't dismantle their identity. They can grieve, adjust, learn, and move forward without questioning their fundamental value. That's a level of emotional stability most people never experience, because they're constantly renegotiating who they are based on feedback. Interestingly, people who don't need validation are often deeply self-reflective, not in a self-critical way, but in a curious one. They observe their motivations closely. They ask themselves uncomfortable questions. They don't avoid inner conflict because they're not afraid of discovering flaws. Validation seeking thrives on avoidance. Avoidance of inadequacy, rejection, and discomfort. Internal validation thrives on honesty, even when that honesty is inconvenient. You might notice that these people rarely explain themselves excessively. Over-explaining is often a subconscious attempt to secure approval, to preempt misunderstanding, to control perception. When you don't need validation, you trust that the right people will understand, and the wrong ones don't need convincing. This doesn't mean they're secretive, it means they respect their own boundaries. Not everything needs to be justified. Not every choice needs an audience. Another subtle sign is how they respond to being ignored. For most people, being ignored triggers a cascade of self-doubt. Did I do something wrong? Am I not interesting enough? Should I try harder? For someone who doesn't need validation, being ignored registers as information, not a verdict. They don't chase attention to soothe anxiety. They redirect energy to places where it's naturally reciprocated. This self-respect protects them from emotional exhaustion and resentment. There's also a noticeable difference in how they experience success. Success doesn't become a performance or a pedestal. It becomes an extension of internal alignment. They don't need everyone to know. They don't need constant recognition. This doesn't mean they hide their achievements, but they don't rely on applause to make success feel real. That internal anchoring prevents the hollow feeling many people experience after reaching goals they thought would finally make them feel worthy. If you're listening closely, you might be realizing that not needing validation isn't about confidence in the traditional sense. It's not about thinking you're better than others. It's about being deeply okay with being yourself, even when that self is uncertain, evolving, or imperfect. That kind of acceptance removes the urgency from life. Decisions are made with clarity instead of desperation. Relationships are chosen with intention instead of fear. And slowly, life begins to feel less like a performance and more like an experience. This mindset also changes how they deal with attention. When attention comes, they don't cling to it. When it leaves, they don't panic. Their sense of self doesn't fluctuate with visibility. This makes them surprisingly adaptable. They can move between different social contexts without losing themselves. They can be alone without feeling lonely. They can be admired without becoming dependent on admiration. That balance is rare, and it's one of the reasons people often project onto them qualities they don't consciously cultivate. At some point, many people ask whether this way of being is learned or innate. The truth is, it's usually forged, often through moments where seeking validation failed, where approval was given and taken away unpredictably, where being liked didn't lead to fulfillment. Those experiences create cracks in the illusion that validation equals security. And through those cracks, self-trust begins to form. Slowly at first, then with growing strength. If you're still here, it's likely because something in this resonates. Not as a distant concept, but as a quiet recognition. Maybe you felt glimpses of this state. Moments where you didn't care what others thought, where you acted from truth instead of approval. Those moments aren't accidents, they're signals. And the more you understand this psychology, the more those moments expand. Staying connected to ideas like this isn't about motivation. It's about remembering something you already know but were taught to forget. One of the most paradoxical outcomes of not needing validation is influence. People who don't chase approval often become influential precisely because they don't. Their words carry weight because they aren't tailored for applause. Their actions feel authentic because they aren't optimized for perception. In social dynamics, this creates a power inversion. The less you need something, the more leverage you have. And when what you no longer need is approval, you gain an unusual kind of freedom. This freedom shows up in small ways. They don't rush to respond to messages to seem important. They don't post for reassurance. They don't adjust their personality to fit the room. They show up as they are and let the environment respond. This doesn't guarantee acceptance, but it guarantees integrity. And over time, integrity attracts the kind of connection that doesn't require performance. Emotionally, they experience a deeper sense of calm. Not constant happiness, but stability. Their mood isn't as reactive. Their self-talk isn't as harsh. When something goes wrong, they don't immediately internalize it as a personal failure. This reduces chronic stress and creates space for genuine growth. Instead of asking, "How do I look?" they ask, "What can I learn?" That shift alone changes the trajectory of a life. They're also comfortable with being disliked, not in a defiant way, but in an accepting one. They understand that being universally liked is impossible and often undesirable. Dislike becomes a natural byproduct of authenticity rather than a problem to solve. This acceptance removes the need to self-censor constantly. And without self-censorship, clarity emerges. It's important to understand that this psychology doesn't mean isolation. In fact, it often leads to deeper, more honest relationships. When you don't need validation, you don't use people to regulate your self-worth. You meet them as equals. You listen without needing to impress. You give without expecting emotional repayment. This creates a sense of safety in relationships that validation-driven dynamics rarely achieve. Over time, people who don't need validation develop a strong internal narrative. They know who they are, what they value, and where they're going, even if the path changes. This narrative acts as a stabilizing force during uncertainty. When life becomes unpredictable, they don't lose themselves trying to adapt to external expectations. They adapt while staying rooted. That's resilience in its truest form. You might be wondering if this means they never doubt themselves. They do. But their doubt doesn't spiral into self-erasure. It becomes a signal to reflect, not a verdict to obey. Doubt and self-trust coexist. That balance is what keeps them grounded rather than rigid. There's also a creative advantage here. When you don't need validation, you're more willing to explore ideas that might not be immediately accepted. You're less afraid of being wrong. This opens the door to originality. Many of the most impactful thinkers, artists, and innovators operated from internal validation long before external recognition arrived. Not because they were special, but because they trusted their internal compass more than public opinion. As this understanding settles in, you might notice a subtle invitation forming. An invitation to stop asking for permission to be yourself. To notice when you're editing your thoughts for approval. to experiment with silence instead of explanation. These aren't dramatic changes, they're quiet ones. But quiet changes are often the most permanent. And here's the final shift that defines people who don't need validation. They feel whole even when no one is watching. Their sense of meaning doesn't depend on being seen. Their worth doesn't require confirmation. That doesn't make them superior. It makes them free. Free to engage, to withdraw, to change, to stay, without betraying themselves. If this perspective has been holding your attention, that's not random. It's the same part of you that's tired of performing and ready to live with more internal authority. Keeping that part of you engaged, exposing it to ideas that strengthen self-trust rather than dependency, can quietly reshape how you move through the world. And once that process starts, it tends to accelerate. The psychology of people who don't need validation isn't about rejecting others. It's about choosing yourself without apology. And when you do that, something unexpected happens. The world responds, not because you demanded approval, but because you no longer needed it.